When the courier delivered a $2,000 gift box addressed only to her, I knew the line had long been crossed. Emily hadn't so much as hinted at any surprise, let alone one heavy enough to require a dolly and two burly guys. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Her usual Bible study group met that evening, and she was out volunteering at Grace Community Church's monthly food drive. I was alone in our Lincoln Park apartment when they knocked. I remembered when we first started dating how she'd told me her faith was the center of her life. She'd dragged me to Sunday service twice a month, and though I'd roll my eyes at the hymns, I loved watching the way her eyes lit up during communion. Emily was a committed Christian, involved in youth outreach and charity bazaars, and she'd always been transparent about her love for her congregation. So when the delivery men wheeled that enormous satin-wrapped box into our living room, my gut twisted in horror. Of course, she claimed it was from her Aunt Margot in California. Marge had always sent extravagant care packages, right? Except the return address was Platinum Events, New York, and the enclosed note, printed on thick cardstock, said simply, "For an unforgettable night, A." For a moment I stared at that lone initial as if it might morph into an apology. Instead, I saw arrogance. I tried to push thoughts away, told myself I was overreacting. Maybe A was her cousin's new beau, Alex, who once hosted her at a Broadway show pre-pandemic. But that evening, after she slipped back in carrying salads and casseroles for the dinner hall, her phone buzzed incessantly in her purse. I watched her smile at each message, thumbs dancing too fast for me to decipher. I felt a prickle in my neck, a warning I'd ignored before. That night, I didn't sleep well. At 2 a.m., I fired up my laptop, opened her LinkedIn. We had separate passwords, but she'd saved me as Michael S. under her connections. I'd had access since our first Christmas. Scrolling through her recent tags and posts, I froze at one that glowed on the screen. "Thank you for an unforgettable night. Can't wait for the next one." It was from her manager, Ryan Caldwell, public, tagged to her profile. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m. last Friday, 2 nights before the gift box arrived. My heart pounded. Ryan was a married man, someone I had met once at her office holiday party. I knew enough to feel sick. In that instant, I understood. My Emily, my church-going Emily, had crossed every line I thought existed. And nothing would ever be the same. That morning, I could hardly breathe as sunlight broke across our bedroom window. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, half expecting to see someone I didn't recognize. My shirt was still rumpled from last night's tossing, and the knot in my stomach felt like concrete. I tiptoed downstairs before Emily awoke, determined to find more evidence before deciding what to say. In the living room, that satin-wrapped box sat like an accusation, and beside it lay her purse and phone. My hands shook as I picked up her iPhone, swiping to unlock. Thankfully, she still used my thumb to authorize logins. Inside, I found messages from R. Caldwell lighting up the screen, heart eye emojis, "Missed you," "Late night, wish you were here" gifs. There were calendar invites to Oyster Bar 8 p.m. scheduled for last Thursday, exactly when she'd told me she was hosting the youth group's fundraising meeting at church. Underneath, a confirmation from Open Table for 2 at a seafood restaurant she'd never mentioned before. I sank onto the couch and reread each text, each one slicing deeper than the next. By the time Emily padded downstairs in her slippers, humming a hymn she'd been learning, I'd screenshot every incriminating message and printed the LinkedIn post on crisp paper. She handed me a mug of coffee, eyes bright and warm, asking about my morning. I folded the printouts into thirds and pressed them into my palm, watching her face fall as I passed them over. "What is this?" she whispered, voice cracking. I felt anger and sorrow collide. Rage at Ryan, at Emily, at myself for being so blind. "You told me last week you were at church until midnight," I said. "Then why did you book this reservation?" I pointed to the Open Table confirmation. Her lips trembled. She opened her mouth, then closed it. The silence was louder than any confession. She sank beside me, tears welling. "Michael, she began. But no sorry could erase that post-it note-sized lie. I watched her shoulders shake as she tried to explain away timestamp after timestamp. My heart pounded, blood roaring in my ears. The girl who once held my hand at communion now held only my shattered trust. I knew we were past the point of repair, but I also knew I had to hear every detail. So I sat there, coffee forgotten, screen glowing with proof, and braced myself for the truth. Her confession tumbled out like broken glass. She told me about Ryan, how he'd been supportive during her burnout last quarter, how office beers had turned into late dinners, how he'd listened to her sermon ideas and praised her charity work until the compliments felt like worship. It started innocently, she sobbed, voice catching on each syllable. He asked for coffee after work one evening, said he wanted to help me plan the youth retreat. We went to that oyster bar because the church kitchen was closed. I didn't know how to say no. I watched her, chest heaving, as the truth poured forth. Messages sent after 10 p.m., stolen kisses in a parked car behind the church parking lot, promises whispered under moonlight that they'd figure it out later. Later was now. Later was here, inked on printed screens and glossy gift wrap. I felt my world tilt. This wasn't just unintended sin. They'd hidden it with a fervor usually reserved for prayer. My throat constricted. I wanted to scream, to ask why she'd risk her reputation, why she'd risk us, but the words stuck like thorns. Instead, I let her speak. She talked about her guilt, her shame, how she'd planned to confess after Easter service, how she'd meant to cut him off. But when he'd sent flowers to her desk with a handwritten card, he spelled out, "You are more precious to me than anything in this world." Her resolve had crumbled. I slid off the couch, pacing the length of our living room, clutching the open table printout like a lifeline. The coffee table bore witness to my devastation. Phone screenshots, LinkedIn tags, the inscrutable satin box. I paced past our framed wedding photos. Wedding, I reminded myself, though we'd never married. Engagement, we'd joked, but we'd talked about rings. I felt betrayed by the woman who once knelt beside me in prayer, her prayers rising like smoke on Sunday mornings. When I finally stopped, she was kneeling on the floor, head bowed, tears soaking the carpet. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and I flinched away. "Michael, I am so sorry," she whispered. "I never wanted to hurt you." And there it was, the apology I needed and didn't need, a hollow echo in an empty sanctuary. I realized then that faith could bind you, but deceit could tear you apart with far greater force. I glanced at my own reflection in the window, a silhouette framed by the rising sun, light filtering through stained glass, casting colored shadows across my grief. I drew in a ragged breath. I had loved her with everything I had, and now I had to decide what love meant when trust was gone. The next morning, I drove to Ryan Caldwell's office in Midtown, gripping my steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles whitened. The city felt surreal, the streets crawling with strangers unaware of my personal apocalypse. I parked a few blocks away and walked past the glass facade of his building, my heart thudding in my ears like a warning drum. My phone buzzed in my pocket, Emily's name. But I silenced it. I needed this, a final reckoning, a confrontation that felt terrifyingly necessary. Inside, I asked the receptionist if I could see Mr. Caldwell for a moment. She gave me a polite smile and paged him, murmuring that he'd be right down. I set the printed LinkedIn post and our screenshots on the coffee table in the lobby, unable to sit. When Ryan emerged, suit crisp and tie perfectly knotted, his face shifted from professional neutrality to stunned recognition. There was no hiding it. He knew why I was there. I laid the LinkedIn printout in front of him. "You left this on your desk?" I asked, voice low but steady. He flicked his eyes to it, then back to me, confusion turning to guilt. "Michael," he started, but I cut in. "You tagged her. You posted about our unforgettable night for the world to see." My voice cracked. He swallowed, glancing around the lobby where other professionals were waiting for their elevators, oblivious to the moral collision happening in their midst. He stammered an apology, spoke of regret, claimed he'd meant no harm, that it had just happened. But reading his eyes, I saw there was no true remorse, only embarrassment. I closed the file folder and stood up, sliding the printout back across the table. "You know she's engaged. She's devoted to her community, to her faith. You betrayed all of it, and you betrayed me." My words hung between us, heavy and final. Ryan nodded awkwardly, unable to meet my gaze. "I'm sorry," he repeated, more rehearsed than real. I turned, lifted my chin, and walked away, each step echoing. The painful clarity was this. Our church group, our shared beliefs, even the hymns I once mocked, all felt hollow now. Faith without honesty was just performance. Back in my car, I let out a shuddering breath I didn't know I'd been holding. The city lights flashed by as I drove home. I didn't call Emily. I didn't tell her what had happened here. Instead, I watched the skyline blur and wondered if forgiveness was possible, and whether I even wanted it anymore. There was no relief in returning to our apartment that night. The door swung open on an emptiness I hadn't fully felt before. Her sweaters hung in the closet like ghosts. The kitchen counters still held the dishes from Sunday's dinner. I flicked on the lights, but the warmth they promised felt fractured, as if the bulbs themselves had grown tired. I sank onto the sofa and stared at the spot where she used to curl up beside me, her head resting on my shoulder as we watched late-night comedies. Now it felt like sacred ground desecrated. I pulled out my phone and drafted a message to Emily, long, rambling, torn between fury and heartbreak, but deleted it before sending. I realized that words, even true ones, could wound deeper if they weren't spoken face to face. Instead, I waited for her to come home. When the key turned in the lock, she stood in the doorway, clutching her purse like a lifeline. Her eyes were hollow, the faith I had once admired, stripped bare. "I'm leaving," she breathed before I could speak. Her voice was brittle, as if it might shatter. I gestured to the living room, to the space she no longer belonged to. She stepped inside, the silence swallowing her whole. "I've scheduled a women's retreat for next month," she said, voice tight. "I need to find myself again. Without Ryan, without us." She avoided my gaze. I nodded, though every fiber of me wanted to beg her to stay, to promise I would forgive. But forgiveness felt like a bridge I couldn't cross without losing myself. "I understand," I managed, throat raw. It was a lie. Understanding was the last thing I felt, but it was the only kindness left. She packed a duffel bag on the couch beside her carefully folded sweaters. Each fold was a dagger. She paused as she zipped the bag, looked at me with those church-bright eyes dulled by shame. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and it was the truest thing she'd said. When she walked out, her heel clicks faded into the hallway like an echo of the woman I thought I knew. The door clicked shut once, twice, and then it stayed closed. I sat there until dawn, the hush of the empty rooms pressing against my ears. In the quiet aftermath, I found myself returning to the little things, rereading the hymn lyrics she loved, scrolling through photos of our laughter at community potlucks, cradling the mug she never used again. Each memory was a bittersweet hymn, beautiful in its truth but impossible to sing together. Days turned into weeks. I started attending service alone, not out of hope for reconciliation, but to reclaim the faith that betrayal had nearly stolen. I volunteered at the food drive she once led, handing out meals with steady hands. The congregation welcomed me with gentle smiles. They asked no questions. In their forgiveness, I found the courage to forgive myself. And in that slow return, one prayer at a time, one canned good at a time, I realized that love can fracture, but grace can mend. It wouldn't be easy, and the scars would remain, like the faint imprint of her perfume on our couch cushions. But I was learning that even when your world falls apart, you can piece it back together with threads stronger than trust, faith, compassion, and the quiet resolve to sing your own hymn again.